Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The hallway in Christopher's apartment was a thing of quiet geometry. A tunnel of oak floorboards and cream-colored walls he had walked 10,000 times. He knew its size, the particular creak of the third board from the bathroom door, the way the afternoon sun from the living room window at its end laid down a precise, warm rectangle of light like a doormat of gold. But that morning, standing with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, he saw the flaw. The rectangle of light was not a perfect rectangle. Its furthest edge, where it should have met the baseboard with a clean, sharp line, was instead blurred, as if diluted. A soft, smoky darkness clung there, not a shadow cast by anything, but a stain on the light itself. He blinked, and it was gone, the line sharp again. He told himself it was a trick of sleep, a filament of dream still caught in his eye, and he walked the hall, his feet finding their familiar complaints in the wood, and tried to forget the way the darkness had not been an absence, but a presence, a thickness that had eaten the light. The mirror arrived on a Tuesday, swaddled in a coffin of gray foam and unvarnished pine. Christopher had found it in a cluttered antique shop in a town that seemed to exist only in the rain, a place called Caleb's Curios. The proprietor, a man with eyes the color of old dishwater and a voice that never rose above a murmur, had called it a speculator's glass. It was a massive thing, an oval of beveled mercury glass set in a frame of blackened oak, carved with spirals that suggested neither vine nor serpent. But something caught between the two. Its surface did not reflect. It was a pool of smoked graphite, a portal into a room made of fog. Christopher paid it in cash, drawn to its profound silence, its refusal to give him back his own face. The shopkeeper, Caleb, had taken the money with fingers that were cold and dry as paper. "It sees both ways," he'd whispered, not meeting Christopher's eye. "Remember that. It sees both ways." He hung it in his study, opposite the large window that overlooked the fire escape and the brick wall of the adjacent building. The room immediately felt different. Fuller, dark, denser, dark. The air grew still, as if holding its breath. The mirror absorbed sound, the distant traffic muting to a submarine rumble. It absorbed light, too. The room, even at noon, seemed trapped in a perpetual gentle twilight, the colors deepening, bleeding into one another like wet ink. Christopher, a historian of minor European wars, found he could work for hours before it, his words on the page becoming more fluid, more incisive, as if the mirror's silence sharpened his thoughts. He began to talk to it, low confessions of mundane worries, the crack in his coffee mug, the strange, hollow tone in his sister's last phone call, the way a hallway light sometimes failed. He first noticed the memories a week later. He was trying to recall the face of his grandfather, a man who had died when Christopher was 9. He could remember the smell of pipe tobacco, the rough wool of his cardigan, but the face was a smudge. Frustrated, he glanced at the mirror. And there, in its smoky depths, not on the surface but within it, like a scene viewed through a window into a foggy past, he saw the old man's face, clear as day, smiling, a wisp of smoke curling from the pipe beside his head. Christopher gasped, and the image vanished, sucked back into the graphite gloom. He experimented. The first kiss, with Clara in the rain outside the library. The red bicycle he'd gotten for his 10th birthday. The view from a childhood window of a thunderstorm rolling in. Each memory, when concentrated upon, would swim up from the depths of the mirror, perfect, three-dimensional, illuminated from within by their own private light. The mirror was not a reflector. It was a repository. It was silvered on both sides, Caleb had said. It trapped light. And light, Christopher realized with a dawning icy thrill, was all a memory was. Photons that had bounced off a moment and into your eye, now trapped forever in the jelly of your mind. The mirror was stealing them, pulling them from the soft tissue of his brain and fixing them in its impossible dense glass. He called Elizabeth. She was a photographer, obsessed with the materiality of images, with what lies just outside the frame. He told her only that he had found an anomalous object, a non-reflective mirror. Her curiosity, a sharp and living thing, did the rest. She arrived with her cameras, digital, a large format film beast on a tripod, even a wet plate collodion kit, smelling of chemistry and old magic. She saw it and went very still. "It's not a mirror," she said, her voice hushed. "It's a hole. A beautifully framed hole." She set up her equipment, her movements ritualistic and precise. The digital camera yielded only a black square. The film camera, when she developed the sheet in his bathroom-turned-darkroom, showed a faint, swirling gray vortex. But the wet plate process, the one that captured images on glass with silver nitrate, was different. As she coated the plate, exposed it, and developed it, they both watched, breathless. The image that emerged was not of the room. It was a man, standing in a barren gray space, his hands pressed against the inside of the glass from the other side. His face was a scream of utter desolation, his eyes two pools of perfect black. Written in the emulsion at the bottom, like a ghost signature, was the name Caleb, the previous owner, Christopher breathed. "He's not on the other side of the glass," Elizabeth said, her face pale in the red darkroom light. "He's in it. You said it's silvered on both sides. There's no other side. There's only the in-between. He's trapped in the silver." That night, the creature came. Christopher awoke to the smell of ozone and cold stone. The digital clock by his bed had died, its numbers extinguished. The apartment was silent, a silence so complete it had weight and pressure. And it was dark. Not the dark of night, but a total, absolute dark that swallowed the faint glow of the city, the green lead of the power strip, the luminous dial of his watch. This dark was a solid thing. He felt it first as a chill, a winter morning cold that seeped from the hallway. Then he heard it. Not a sound, but the negation of sound. A slow, relentless unsound that consumed the faint hum of the refrigerator, the drip of the kitchen tap, replacing them with a void that rang in his ears. He lay paralyzed, his heart a frantic bird in a cage of ribs. At the threshold of his bedroom door, the perfect darkness coalesced. It was not a shape, for it had no edges. It was a standing wave of nothingness, a hole cut out of reality. It had a presence, a hunger that was not for flesh, but for luminance, for resonance, for the faint afterglow of lived experience. It was the eater of echoes. It was drawn to the mirror, to the concentrated, stolen light within it. Christopher watched, unable to blink, as the thing of total darkness flowed down the hallway toward his study. It did not move through the air. It replaced the air, inch by inch, with its own profound negation. It passed, and where it had been, the world felt thin, washed out, as if all its history had been scoured away. The next morning, the hallway was different. The cream paint was the same, the oak boards identical, but the memory of the hallway was gone. The 10,000 passages, the echoes of his own footsteps, the ghost impressions of conversations held there, all had been leached away, leaving only a sterile, architectural shell. The creak of the third board was just a sound now, empty of association. The creature had fed, Not on the mirror's hoard, but on the ambient light memories soaked into the very walls. Elizabeth saw the change in him immediately. His eyes had a hollow look, as if someone had turned down the lights behind them. He was forgetting small things, where he left his keys, the ending of a book he'd just finished, the name of his favorite coffee shop. The mirror was siphoning his past, and the creature was consuming the present's potential for memory. They were caught between the collector and the devourer. They tracked down Caleb's obituary. He had died not in the shop, but in a state-run hospice. A gradual fading, the nurse said over the phone, her voice bored with old tragedy. It just dimmed, forgot everything. Who he was, how to speak, how to swallow light. By the end, his eyes were like clear glass. Nothing left inside to reflect. Christopher understood then. Caleb had not just owned the mirror. He had become its custodian and then its victim. The mirror had filled with his light, and the creature, drawn to the feast, had taken the rest, leaving him an empty vessel. Now Christopher was the custodian. The ritual was clear. He sat before the mirror nightly now, feeding it his brightest memories. A sacrificial offering to keep the darkness at bay. His mother's laughter. The feeling of summer grass. The plot of his first, unfinished novel. Each one flowed from him into the smoky glass, leaving a colder, quieter place inside his mind where it had been. He was making himself a void to fill the void. Elizabeth, armed with her wet plate glass negative of Caleb, confronted him. "You're letting it eat you," she said, her voice cracking. "We have to destroy it." "It's not that simple," Christopher whispered, his eyes fixed on the mirror's depths where the memory of a lost sunset was slowly dying. "It's a part of the house now, a part of me. To break it might be to break everything it's touched." She devised a plan, a final photograph. She would use the oldest, most light-hungry process, a daguerreotype on a sheet of pure silver. She would photograph the mirror and then, using a bank of ultraviolet lights, try to overload it, to flood its double-silvered prison with a light so pure it would shatter the bonds holding the stolen memories. It was alchemy, an exorcism by photonic blast. The night of the ritual, the apartment was a cathedral of tension. Elizabeth had her apparatus set up, the large box camera, the silver plates, the banks of UV lights humming with a sinister, insectile vibration. Christopher sat before the mirror, a sentinel. The air grew thick and cold an hour before midnight. The creature was coming, drawn by the planned concentration of light, a greater feast than ever before. It manifested in the study doorway, a pillar of living darkness. The room darkened around it, the lights seeming to flee, to cower in the corners. The hum of the UV lights faltered, choked by the unsound. Elizabeth, her hands steady with a terror she had transmuted into purpose, triggered the camera's shutter. There was a click, absurdly small in the swallowing quiet. Then she threw the switch for the UV lights. They flared to life with a violent, actinic glare, a light that was all edge and no warmth, a light that cut. It struck the mirror, and the mirror screamed. It was a sound made of 1,000 shattered memories, a cacophony of lost laughter, forgotten cries, abandoned whispers, all torn from their silvery moorings. Light, not just UV, but the stolen, memory-saturated light of a lifetime, erupted from the glass in a blinding, silent explosion. It was a supernova in a box. The creature of darkness recoiled, not in pain, but in ravenous ecstasy. It flowed into the beam, drinking the unleashed memories, a black hole consuming a star. It grew denser, more real, its edges becoming sharp and terrible against the torrent of light. Christopher watched, but he was not seeing with his eyes. The blast had connected him to the mirror, to Caleb, to the river of stolen time. He saw Caleb's life, not as a story, but as a flickering ribbon of illuminated moments, now being unraveled and devoured by the darkness. He saw his own life, a shorter, brighter ribbon, being pulled taut toward the same maw. But he understood the truth then, the final, awful revelation. The creature was not an external predator. It was the void on the other side of the silver. It was the hunger inherent in preservation. Trap a memory is to acknowledge its loss. The mirror did not attract the darkness. The mirror created the darkness by the very act of hoarding the light. He and Caleb were not its victims. They were its priests, gathering the sacrifice. The UV lights died, their filaments blown. The room plunged into a blackness deeper than any night. In the silence that followed, a silence that was no longer an absence but a held breath, Christopher felt a change. The oppressive density of the creature was gone. The mirror on the wall was just a piece of glass now, clear and empty, its silver backing vaporized by the photonic storm. A fine metallic dust coated everything. Elizabeth was a shape on the floor, breathing, unconscious. Her hand still on the camera's cable release. Christopher stood. He walked to the blank mirror. He saw his reflection, clear and sharp for the first time. But the face that looked back was not his own. It was Caleb's face, the face from the wet plate photograph, etched with infinite weariness. And behind that face, layered like a ghost double exposure, was his own. He blinked, and it was just his own face again, pale and haunted. He turned and walked out of the study, down the hallway. The rectangle of afternoon sun was perfect, sharp-cornered, golden, but it gave no warmth. He felt nothing when he looked at it. He reached the end of the hall, to the living room window, and looked out at the brick wall. He tried to summon the memory of why he had chosen this apartment, the hope he'd felt moving in. There was nothing, a blank space. He tried to remember Elizabeth's smile from before all this, just a vague concept of a smile, attached to no feeling. He's in the hallway now. He will always be in the hallway. The door to the study is open behind him. The clean, empty mirror hangs, waiting. He knows the creature is not gone. It is sated for now. It slumbers in the silence between his thoughts, in the newly created voids where his memories used to be. He is the custodian of an empty archive. He's the silence after the scream. He is the negative space. And he is so very, very hungry for the light. The hunger was not a stomach pang. It was a hollowing in the center of his mind, a quiet, constant pull toward any source of luminance that held a story. He watched a neighbor's window across the alley, where a family sat around a dinner table, their gestures animated in the warm yellow light. He felt not warmth, but a cold, sharp craving. He wanted to drink that scene, to trap its light in the silvered vault of himself. He understood Caleb completely now. The shop had not been a business. It had been a feeding ground. Elizabeth found him there. She touched his arm, and he flinched. Her touch was a sensation, but it carried no history, no echo of affection. It was just data. Christopher? Her voice was frayed with fear. He turned his head slowly. He saw the concern etched into her features, the intelligence in her eyes, the faint dusting of metallic powder on her cheek. He noted these facts. They did not move him. "It's over," she said. But it was a question. "It is not over," he replied. His own voice sounded distant, borrowed. "It has changed form. The vessel was destroyed. The contents needed a new repository." Her eyes widened as she understood. "No. The memories are not lost. They were consumed. And the thing that consumed them, it left an imprint. I am the template. I am the template." He looked back out the window. The family had risen, clearing plates. A memory tried to surface in him. His own family, a similar ritual. But it was just a phantom limb, a shape of pain with no substance. "We fight it," Elizabeth said, her photographer's mind already seeking angles, exposures. "We fill you back up. We take new pictures, make new memories, strong ones." "Me? No. You cannot fill a sieve," he said. "The hunger is structural now. It is the definition of my being. To see light is to want to devour it, to save it from the dark by making it part of the dark. Caleb must have felt this." He found the mirror to give the hunger a focus, a tool. But the tool always turns on the hand. He walked past her, back into the study. The air still smelled of ozone and burnt silver. He stood before the clear, reflective glass. His reflection was perfect, and utterly empty. He saw the room behind him, Elizabeth frozen in the doorway, the apparatus of her failed exorcism. He saw it all, and he wanted to swallow it. "What do we do?" Elizabeth's whisper was a plea. "You leave," Christopher said, his gaze locked on his own eyes in the glass. "You take every photograph you have of me, every letter, every trace. You burn them. You forget this address. You let the memory of me fade, because if you remember me, you feed me. And I am always hungry. I won't abandon you. You already have," he said, and the truth of it was a cold stone in his gut. "The Christopher you knew is in here, somewhere in the dark behind my eyes. He is a memory I have eaten. You are remembering a ghost." She argued. She cried. She threatened to call authorities. He was silent through it all. A man-shaped stillness. Finally, exhausted, she gathered her things. At the door, she looked back. He did not turn. "Goodbye, Christopher." He heard the door close. He heard her footsteps recede down the hall outside his apartment. He listened until the last echo of her presence was absorbed by the walls, by the air, by the hungry silence within him. He is in the study now. The empty mirror hangs. He knows what he must do, what Caleb must have done. He will become a curator of light. He will frequent busy cafes and parks, not to live, but to feed. He will watch the bright, fleeting moments of strangers, and he will siphon their resonance, pulling the light into his own hollow silver. He will grow colder, quieter, a blur at the edge of vision. The creature and he are one. It is not a parasite. It is his true self, revealed. The afternoon fades. The rectangle of light in the hallway narrows, sharpens, and vanishes. True night falls. Christopher does not turn on a lamp. He sits in the dark, which is no longer an absence, but his element. He waits. Tomorrow, he will begin his collection. He will walk in the sun, and it will not warm him. He will be a speculator, trading in borrowed light, paying for it with the slow, certain erosion of his own soul. The hallway is quiet. The geometry is perfect. And in the stillness, a new, faint creak groans in the floorboards, a sound he does not remember. A memory the house itself is making, and which he already desperately wants to own. Story 2. The steady, rhythmic thump of the knife against the cutting board stopped. It was not the pause of a task completed, nor the hesitation of a chef considering the seasoning. It was an interruption, a severance, as if the sound itself had been cut from the air. In the sudden silence that flooded his small, dim kitchen, Gary felt the void as a physical pressure in his ears, a hollow expectation. He looked down at his own hands, pale and trembling around the handle of his cheap chef's knife, a piece of wilted celery halved beneath it. The silence was wrong. It was the silence of a stopped heart. This was his life now, after the fall. Gary, once the palate of Providence, whose reviews could shutter restaurants or crown kings, now wrote listicles about artisanal pickles for a website that smelled vaguely of digital desperation. His own palate, that once infallible instrument, was ruined. Everything tasted of ash and regret. He had become a ghost in the world of flavor, haunting his own past. The invitation arrived not by post or email, but slipped under his door on a slip of paper the color of old cream. It bore no no-go, only an address in the meatpacking district, a time, 11:47 p.m., an oddly specific minute, and a single word, satiety. He went because curiosity was the last spice he could still perceive. The address led to a rusted freight door marked only by a single, unlit iron sconce. At 11:46, it swung inward without a sound. A narrow corridor, walls the deep red of dried blood, absorbed him. The air was warm, humid, and carried a scent that bypassed memory and spoke directly to the marrow. It was the smell of earth after a summer rain, of searing meat, of myrrh and copper, and something sweetly, profoundly rotten. It was the smell of a kitchen that was also a temple or a tomb. He was led to a room containing only a single, rough-hewn table and a chair. No menu. No other diners. A single candle, tall and black, guttered in the center of the table, its flame casting more shadow than light. From the darkness beyond, a figure emerged. She was tall, her face all sharp angles and quiet intensity, her eyes the color of a winter sea at dusk. She placed a plain white bowl before him. In it rested a single portion of something that defied identification. "What is it?" Gary asked, his critic's vocabulary failing him. The woman, who would later name herself Isabel, smiled a smile that did not touch her eyes. It is what you need," she said, her voice a low, resonant cello note. "Nothing more, nothing less." It was not a stew, nor a ragout, nor a confit. It was a substance, deep umber and shimmering with a faint internal luminescence. It held textures within it, something that yielded like slow braised tendon, something that crunched like delicate cartilage, something that melted on the tongue like marrow. He brought the first spoonful to his lips. The taste was a revelation that felt like a violation. It did not simply please his palate. It answered a question he had not known his soul was asking. It tasted of the crisp, inky print of his first published review, of the approving clap on the shoulder from his long-dead father, of the perfect, silent understanding he had once shared with a lover before fame corroded it all. It tasted of significance, of being right and good and necessary. A warmth spread from his stomach, not the heat of spice, but the glow of a long-extinguished inner fire being meticulously rekindled. He ate. He wept. He scraped the bowl clean with his finger, the ceramic clicking against his nail like a tiny, hungry bone. When he looked up, sated in a way that felt spiritual, Isabel was watching him from the shadows. The candle flame reflected in her eyes, twin points of hungry light. "You will come back," she said. It was not a question. He did. Again and again. He sold his first editions, his vintage wine collection, to fund his visits. He stopped writing altogether. The world outside the red corridor faded to a monochrome smear. Only the bowl, only the taste of profound fulfillment, held color and meaning. He began to change, his senses inverted. Sunlight felt abrasive. Common food tasted like damp cardboard. The sound of traffic was a hellish cacophony. He craved only the silence of the red room, the dance of the single shadow thrown by that black candle, the rhythmic, sacred sound of Isabel's knife in the distant kitchen. A sound that always, eventually, stopped, leaving that same pregnant, holy silence. He met Callum on a night when his own need was a screaming animal in his gut. Callum was a ghost of a man, propped in his chair, his suit hanging from a frame that seemed to be dissolving from within. His eyes were vast, starry pools of craving. He was spooning the substance into his mouth with a frantic, mechanical urgency, but a trickle of it leaked from the corner of his lips, as if his body was rejecting what his soul demanded. "It knows," Callum whispered, his voice a dry leaf rustle. "It knows what you lack. It fills the hollow. But the hollow, it grows. To hold more." He coughed, a wet, shallow sound. "She doesn't just feed you. She cultivates the hunger." Gary recoiled, but the words had taken root. He noticed then that the shadow cast by the candle was not his own. It was taller, thinner, its head tilted at an inquisitive, predatory angle. It did not move when he moved. The journalist, Dale, found him outside his apartment building, a man smelling of rain and cheap coffee and dogged persistence. He showed Gary photos, obituaries. Thin men and women, wasted away, their death certificates citing metabolic collapse or severe malnutrition. All had been, in their final days, fixated on a private, secret meal they would describe only in ecstatic, broken metaphors. "It's a poison, Gary," Dale insisted, his breath fogging the cold air. "A beautiful, perfect poison. It gives you exactly what you want, so you never want anything else. Until there's nothing left of you but the want." That night, in the Red Room, Gary looked at Isabel not as a savior, but as a surgeon. He saw the precision in her hands, the clinical detachment in her gaze as she served him. The dish that night tasted, for the first time, not of fulfillment, but of his own fear. It tasted of Dale's cheap coffee, of the cold rain, of the metallic tang of the obituary page. He ate it anyway. The addiction was a clockwork in his soul, winding tighter. He broke into the restaurant during the dead hours, driven by a final, fading spark of his old self. The kitchen was obsidian and stainless steel, terrifyingly clean. There was no pantry, no larder, only a single, central refrigeration unit. He opened it. There were no recognizable ingredients, no cuts of meat, no bundles of herbs. There were only shapes, wrapped in a membrane that seemed to pulse with a faint, slow light. They were like giant, stillborn hearts, or fleshy, unformed cocoons. One, near the front, had a familiar contour, the curve of a shoulder he knew, a scent, beneath the pervasive myrrh and copper of a particular cologne, now gone sour. Callum dawned. The dish was not made for them. It was made of them, of their longing, their essence, their hollowed-out souls. Isabel was not a chef. She's a farmer. The Red Room was her pasture. The addiction was the crop. She harvested the need, refined it, and served it back to them. A perfect, terrible Ouroboros of desire. He confronted her in the dining room, his body vibrating with horror and withdrawal. The black candle was between them. Its flame was perfectly still. "You understood," Isabel said, her voice filling the silence. "The greatest hunger is not for food. It is for meaning, for wholeness. I provide it. A perfect feedback loop. The ultimate cuisine. It is the only true taste." "It's cannibalism," Gary choked out. "It's communion," she corrected. "You don't consume another. You consume the absence of yourself. I simply recycle the vessel." She took a step forward. Her shadow, thrown large upon the wall, did not follow. It remained behind her, a separate, waiting stain. "You are ripe, Gary. Your need is exquisite. A critic's need for truth, for discernment. It will make a profound reduction." He fled. He ran through the labyrinthine corridors that now seemed to breathe around him. The scent closing in, the sound of her footsteps silent, but everywhere. He burst out into the alley, into the shocking, painful glare of the ordinary world. He locked himself in his apartment. He tried to eat. Bread was dust. Water was rust. His body was rejecting the mundane, having tasted the divine. He was starving in a new way, a deep, cellular starvation. The shadow in his apartment no longer matched his shape. It was taller, thinner, and it stood perfectly still in the corner, watching him from a face of darkness. Dale published his story. It caused a stir, a minor scandal. The restaurant, of course, was gone. Just an empty, cold storage space. Isabel vanished. Gary sits now in his chair. The chair faces the corner where the shadow stands. He is so light, he feels he might float away. His heartbeat, once a steady rhythm in his chest, has become an irregular, lonely knock. Thump, silence. Thump, thump. Long silence. He can still hear it, though. Not the memory, but the actual present sound drifting through the walls of reality itself. The steady, rhythmic thump of the knife on the board. It is the sound of his own heart being prepared. It is the sound of his hunger being honed. It is the most beautiful sound he has ever heard. The knife stops. The silence is absolute. It is the silence of the void before a word is spoken. It is the silence of the plate placed before the empty self. In the corner, the shadow detaches itself from the wall. It steps forward. It is holding a spoon. Gary looks at it, his mouth watering. The spoon was not black, but it drank the light from the room. It was a utensil of pure absence. Gary's body, a desiccated husk propped in the chair, could not move. He had no strength to flee, no voice to scream. He had only the want, a perfect, polished vacuum at his core. The shadow did not walk. It flowed, a spill of deeper night across the worn carpet. It stopped before him. No face, no features, only a sense of profound, patient attention. It raised the spoon. From the empty air before him, from the very fabric of the silence, a scent bloomed. It was his dish, the final one. It smelled of the last good memory he'd ever had before the fall. The clean, sharp taste of a green apple eaten on a cold morning in another life, mixed with the profound, comforting bitterness of knowing how that story ended. It was the taste of closure. A sound escaped him, a dry rattle of breath. His lips parted. The spoon approached. He felt no touch, only a sudden piercing cold on his lower lip. A cold that was also an immense pressure, the weight of a world condensed into a single bite. Then, a frantic pounding at his apartment door. A voice, muffled but insistent. "Gary! Gary, it's Dale! Open up!" The shadow hesitated. The spoon did not withdraw, but the offering paused. The scent of the apple twisted, soured with the intrusion of the present, with the smell of rain on cheap wool, Dale's coat. Gary's eyes, filmed and dull, flickered toward the door. A spark, the last ember of the man who had run, who had investigated, who had been curious, flared in the immense darkness of his need. It was not enough to move his limbs, but it was enough to close his mouth. He shut his lips against the cold spoon. The shadow seemed to ripple. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent of ozone and spoiled honey. Frustration. The pounding on the door became thunderous. "I know you're in there. I have help." With a sound like a sigh through dead leaves, the shadow dissolved. It did not retreat to the corner. It simply unwove itself from the space around him. The darkness flowing back into the mundane shadows of the room, leaving only a lingering chill and the fading echo of his personalized hunger. The lock splintered. Dale and a police officer burst into the room. They found Gary collapsed in the chair, a skeleton draped in papery skin, his eyes wide and fixed on the empty corner. He was alive, but just. He smelled not of sickness, but of a strange aromatic starvation, like a forgotten spice jar. At the hospital, They pumped nutrients into his veins. He gagged on broth, convulsed at the taste of gelatin. His body was a field salted against ordinary life. Dale visited daily, talking at him, showing him newspapers, playing music from his past. Gary was a statue, a vessel filling with substances it could not recognize. But inside, a war was being fought. The silence in his head was no longer pure. It was punctuated by the memory of that pounding door, by the grating, beautiful nuisance of Dale's voice. It was a flaw in the perfect void Isabel had cultivated, a crack. One evening, as a nurse adjusted his IV, a drop of the clear saline fell onto his wrist. He felt it, a sensation. Not taste, not yet, but a temperature, a wetness. It was information. It was something other than the monolithic craving. He turned his head, a movement that cost him dearly. He looked at the window, at the gray smear of the city sky. He made a sound. Dale, dozing in a chair, jerked awake. Gary's tongue, a foreign slab in his mouth, moved. He shaped a word, his voice the rustle of a grave. "Apple," he whispered. It was not a request for the dish. It was a name, a thing, a memory of a thing, separate from him. It was the first step back into the world of ordinary, terrible, beautiful hunger. Dale brought him a green apple the next day. Gary held it for an hour, feeling its cool, hard reality. He did not try to eat it. He simply held it, while in the back of his mind, in the place where the shadow waited, the rhythmic thumping of the knife began again, softer now, but incessant. A counterpoint to the beating of his own stubborn heart. The apple sat on the bedside table, a stark green planet in the sterile wide orbit of the hospital room. Days passed. Gary held it each morning, a ritual. The cool, waxy skin was an anchor. The faint, clean smell that sometimes reached him was a map of a world he had forgotten. He was learning to feel things again, but each sensation was a double-edged sword. The scratch of starch on the hospital sheets was a symphony of texture, but it also grated, a harsh reminder of a reality that was coarse and unfiltered. Dale's coffee smelled acrid, but alive. The doctors were baffled. His body was accepting nutrients intravenously, but his digestive system seemed to have gone dormant, refusing any solid food. They spoke of psychosomatic disorders, of severe somaticization. Gary knew the truth. His body was waiting. It had been promised a specific sacrament, and it would accept no other communion. He was released, a medical mystery in a baggy coat. Dale took him to a new apartment, a small, bright place that felt like an assault. Gary asked for the curtains to be closed. The shadows here were ordinary, shapeless, and he watched them with a mix of terror and contempt. They were not her. He tried to write. A single sentence about the apple took him an afternoon. The green is not a flavor, but a promise of crispness, which is a kind of sound. It was nonsense. It was the first true thing he'd written in years. The act felt like digging a grave for a part of himself, the part that still dreamed of the red room. The hunger was always there, a bass note thrumming beneath every thought. But now, it had a countermelody. The memory of Callum's leaking mouth, the pulsing shapes in the fridge, the shadow with the spoon. His craving was no longer pure. It was poisoned with knowledge. This, he realized, was his new taste. Ash and regret had been replaced by a more complex profile, longing, laced with revulsion. He began to walk the city at night, a ghost haunting his old life. He avoided the meatpacking district, but his feet traced wider and wider circles around it, as if pulled by a decaying orbit. One night, in the rain-slicked alley behind a thriving new bistro, he caught a scent on the wet air. Not the profound aroma of Isabel's kitchen, but a whisper of it. The myrrh and copper note, faint, almost imagined, clinging to the dumpster steam. He followed it like a bloodhound, not with hope, but with a grim necessity. It led him to a nondescript service elevator in a building that housed corporate offices. The scent was strongest here, bleeding from the crack between the elevator doors. He pressed the call button. Nothing. He stood there for an hour, the rain soaking through his coat, until a cleaning crew arrived. He slipped in behind them, a wraith among the living. The elevator had only one button for the sub-basement. It descended with a groan. The doors opened not onto a red corridor, but onto a concrete utility space, humming with generators and lit by flickering fluorescence. And there in the far corner was a door. Not a rusted freight door, but a modern gray steel one, unmarked. But from beneath it, a thin line of crimson light glowed, and from behind it, so faint he felt it in his teeth more than heard it, came the steady, rhythmic thump of a knife on a board. Gary stood frozen. This was not an invitation. This was a discovery. She had moved, evolved. The restaurant was a cancer, metastasizing. He thought of Dale's obituaries. There would be new ones, with new vague causes of death. He didn't approach the door. He turned and left. The craving screamed at him, a siren song from behind the steel. He walked away, each step a battle. He went to Dale. He told him everything, in his rustling, broken voice. He described the door, the scent, the sound. Dale's face hardened with a journalist's resolve, but his eyes held pity. "We'll go to the police. With this, they'll have to listen." Gary shook his head. "They won't find anything. She knows. She'll be gone again. Or worse, they'll open the door and see an empty room, and I'll be the crazy addict who led them on a wild goose chase." He looked at his trembling hands. There's only one way to end it. Dale understood. "You can't go back in there." "I'm not going back to eat," Gary said. And for the first time, his voice held a sliver of its old authority, cold and sharp. "I'm going back to cook." He spent the next week forcing himself to taste. He started with water, identifying the mineral notes, the flatness of the city processing. He moved to plain rice, to steamed carrot. Each was a battle, each flavor a pale, pathetic ghost next to the memory of the feast. But he was not seeking pleasure. He was seeking data. He was recalibrating his ruined palate as a weapon. He identified the chemical aftertaste of industrial stock, the cloying sweetness of mass-produced sauce. He was mapping the geography of the empty, the commercial, the hollow. He purchased a single ingredient from a specialty shop, a rare wild mushroom known for its profound earthy umami. It was the closest thing he could find to a memory of depth. He did not eat it. He held it. He studied it. On the night he chose, he wore dark clothes. In his pocket, he carried the mushroom, wrapped in paper. He took the service elevator down. The gray door was still there, the crimson light still bleeding underneath. The thumping of the knife was steady, a heartbeat in the concrete womb. He did not hesitate. He pushed the door open. The red room was the same, yet different. Smaller, more intimate. The table, the chair, the black candle. Isabel stood beside the table, not emerging from shadows, but waiting, as if she had been expecting him. She wore a simple black dress, her hands clasped before her. Her winter sea eyes held a glint of amusement. "Gary," she said, "you are late for your reservation." "I'm not here to dine," he said. His voice did not shake. "I know," she replied. "You are here to understand, or to try to stop me. Both are futile. The hunger I serve is eternal. I merely give it form." "Your form is a lie," Gary said. He stepped into the room, the scent enveloping him, a wave of nostalgia that made his knees weak. He fought it. "You don't feed hunger. You farm it. You feed on it. A semantic difference. She shrugged. I am a chef, in the truest sense. I transform base matter into experience. What is a chef but one who consumes life to create meaning for others? I have simply refined the process. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wild mushroom. He placed it on the rough-hewn table, next to the black candle. It looked absurd. A little brown lump on the altar of void. I have brought an ingredient, Gary said. Isabel looked at it, then at him, her smile fading into curiosity. It is mundane. It is real, he said. It grew in soil, fed by rain and decay. It tastes of the forest, of process, of time. It is not an answer. It is a question. It is not fulfillment. It is a thing. Separate. Whole. He picked up the mushroom. He did not offer it to her. He raised it to his own lips. He took a bite. The flavor exploded in his mouth. Earthy, complex, peppery. Alive. It was not the taste of his own fulfilled longing. It was the taste of otherness. It was bold, unfamiliar, demanding. It was not a mirror. It was a window. He chewed and swallowed. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. His body recoiled, his stomach clenched, but he held it down. Isabel watched him, her face unreadable. For the first time, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes that was not hunger, nor calculation. It was confusion. You see, Gary said, his mouth still full of the strange, wonderful, ordinary bitterness. It doesn't complete me. It reminds me I am incomplete, and that is enough. The rhythmic thumping of the knife from the unseen kitchen had stopped. The silence that followed was different. It was not the holy, pregnant silence of expectation. It was the silence of a stopped clock, a machine awaiting new instructions. Isabel looked from Gary's face to the half-eaten mushroom, and then to the shadows behind her, where her own shadow, tall and thin, stood apart from her, motionless. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. In the stillness, Gary heard a new sound. Faint, distant, coming from the world above. The sound of traffic. The sound of rain. The sound of life. Messy, unsatisfying, and real. He turned and walked out of the red room, leaving the candle burning, leaving the chef and her shadow in the silence, leaving the perfect poisoned feast forever uneaten on the table of his old hunger. He did not know if he had stopped her, but he had finally stopped himself. The door clicked shut behind him, and he ascended towards the noise and the light, the taste of forest and soil still alive on his tongue. Story 3. The glass on the nightstand trembled. Not a shake, not a rattle, but a fine, high-frequency shudder, as if a tuning fork had been struck deep within the bones of the earth. The water inside it shivered, forming a microscopic meniscus that climbed one side of the glass and then receded. Ernesto, half asleep, registered it as a passing truck on a distant highway, but there were no highways here. Only the long, winding mountain road that had delivered them to the overlook, and the deeper, older roads that lay beneath it. They called it the Overlook Hotel, a name that felt like a promise and a taunt. It sat cupped in the granite palm of the Colorado Rockies, a sprawling edifice of timber and stone built to witness grandeur, and now left to hold only silence. For the winter, it was theirs. Ernesto's duty was to tend the boilers, to patch the leaks the mountain wind would inevitably find, to keep the sleeping giant from freezing solid. Linda saw it as an adventure, a cocoon of isolation to stitch their fraying family back together. Irving, who was 9, said nothing. He simply listened to the hotel breathe. The first week was a symphony of settling. Groans traveled the steam pipes like distant conversations. Floorboards in deserted ballrooms exhaled after decades of pressure. The wind off the peaks played the eaves like a flute. a low, mournful note that never quite ceased. Ernesto would walk the corridors, his footsteps swallowed by the endless burgundy carpet, a pattern of interlocking knots that seemed to twist if you stared too long. He felt a persistent sense of being preemptively echoed, as if his shadow moved a half-second before he did. Irving took to wandering. He was a quiet boy with eyes the color of a winter lake, and he possessed a stillness that made adults uneasy. He would place his palm flat on the wallpaper of the Colorado lounge, feeling not the texture of the paper, but the cold seep of the plaster beneath, and beneath that, something like a slow, thick pulse. In the Gold Cage elevator, he would ride up and down, listening to the hum of the cable, hearing within it a whispered sibilance, a stream of consonants without vowels. Linda tried to make warmth. She baked in the vast kitchen. The smell of cinnamon and yeast, a brave little army against the smell of old wood and damp stone. But the warmth never traveled far. It pooled around the giant range and then died, absorbed by the relentless chill. She began to see things in her peripheral vision, a flutter of curtain in a sealed room, the suggestion of a figure standing at the end of a hall. But when she turned, there was only emptiness, and the emptiness felt watchful. The omens accumulated like snow on the sill. Ernesto, checking the boiler room in the sub-basement, found a pile of old party masks in a corner. They were made of brittle papier-mâché, their colors faded to a uniform gray. A fox, a bear, a king with a lopsided crown. They were dry and cold to the touch, but when he picked up the king, he felt a sudden greasy warmth from the inside, as if it had just been removed from a face. He dropped it. Later, he swore he heard the soft, rustling sound of something being dragged through the pile down there, a sound like laughter through a mouthful of dust. Irving found the scrapbook in the manager's office. It was a chronicle of the hotel's brighter past, but the boy was drawn to the darker margins. Between a photo of a gala and a clipping about a skiing championship, he found a child's drawing, done in frantic, waxy crayon. It showed the hotel, but the windows were screaming mouths, and from the chimney poured not smoke, but a cloud of black, buzzing insects. Scrawled at the bottom in a clumsy hand was, "They sing in the walls. They want a door." One night, the silence changed. It wasn't absence of sound, but a new kind of presence. Ernesto awoke to a deep, rhythmic thudding. Boom, boom, boom. It resonated through the bed frame, through his teeth. It was the sound of a giant heart, or a drum beaten in a cavern far below. He followed it, barefoot, the cold of the floors biting his soles. He traced it to the deserted ballroom. The great space was moonlit, a checkerboard of silver and shadow, and in the center, moving with a slow, impossible grace, was a figure. It was tall, wrapped in shadows that clung like tattered formal wear. It was waltzing, holding another, smaller figure. A figure that shimmered and seemed to be made of the same moonlight collecting in puddles on the floor. The smaller figure had no face, just a smooth, pale oval. The thudding was their feet, or perhaps just the hotel's own pulse, given form. Ernesto watched, frozen, until the music in his head rose to a crescendo, and the figures dissolved into the patterns of the floor. He was left standing there, his own heart hammering a frantic counter-rhythm. His sanity began to erode, not in cracks, but in slow, peeling layers. He became obsessed with the hotel's symmetry, convinced that if he could just balance everything, the chairs, the paintings, the supplies in the pantry, the unsettling energy would settle. He would spend hours in the lounge, adjusting a sofa by millimeters, lining up magazines into perfect right angles. He muttered to himself, arguments with the silence. Linda's comforting touches now made him flinch. They were interruptions in his vital work. Irving's silent watching felt like judgment. The boy, meanwhile, was opening. The psychic membrane that had always separated him from the world's hidden textures was thinning. He saw the hotel's true residents. They were not ghosts, not exactly. They were echoes of emotions so strong they had stained the place. A man's bottomless despair in room 217, which hummed with a cold blue frequency. The violent jealousy in the presidential suite, which felt like red static. And in the long corridor of the West Wing, the sheer, unadulterated hunger. It was a sucking void, a presence that wanted to taste their fear, to drink their warmth, to use their living forms as puppets to feel sensation again. Irving found his guide in a forgotten corner of the library. Not a book, but a man, or the memory of one. His name was Ibrahim, and he appeared as a dark, shimmering outline seated in a wingback chair by a dead fire. His voice was not a sound, but a thought placed directly in Irving's mind, smooth and deep as a stone in a river. They are old, Ibrahim thought to him. Older than the stones this place is built on. The builders found a road here, a path, and they built a gate upon it. The hotel is the lock, but locks can be picked from the inside. Ibrahim showed him how to listen without being heard, how to look without being seen. He taught him that the patterns in the carpet were a kind of binding, a labyrinth to confuse the hungry thing. That the boiler was not just a machine, but a heart, and if it stopped, the hotel would wake up fully. Your father, Ibrahim imparted, a wave of profound sadness flowing with the words, is feeding it. His anger, his fear. It finds the cracks in him and pours itself in. It is making him a key. The revelation came on a night when the wind died completely, leaving a silence so absolute it was a pressure on the eardrums. Ernesto stood at the bar in the gold room, pouring a drink he did not intend to drink. In the clouded mirror behind the bottles, he did not see his own reflection. He saw a version of himself, but triumphant, grinning a grin that split his face too wide. This other Ernesto raised a glass to him. The voice that came was not his own, yet it emerged from his throat, a dry rustle. We've always been here, it said through him. We are the things that waited in the trees when your ancestors huddled around their fires. We are the silence between the stars. You built your little worlds, your houses, your hotels, on our roads. And sometimes we like to come in. Linda heard him speaking and crept down. She saw her husband, his back to her, talking to the mirror. But the words were wrong. The cadence was wrong. She called his name. He turned slowly. His eyes were not his eyes. They were the flat, reflective black of the hotel's windows at midnight. The climax was not a chase, but a terrible, slow seduction. The hotel shed its pretense. The corridor to their living quarters stretched, the far door receding into a pinprick. The wallpaper bled its pattern, the twisting knots unraveling into long black vines that whispered as they grew. Figures emerged from the walls, not whole, but fragments. A hand tapping a rhythm on a doorframe, a mouth smiling from a painting, a chorus of whispers from the air vents chanting a nursery rhyme about a lost child in the snow. Ernesto, the key, walked towards the heart of the hotel, towards the basement and the old, sealed-off foundation stone where the original road was found. He held a fire axe. His purpose was clear to the thing inside him. Break the stone, open the gate. Irving, guided by Ibrahim's fading presence, knew he could not fight his father. He had to fight the hotel. He ran, not away, but into it. To the boiler room. The great iron heart of the place thrummed with heat. The hungry presence hated warmth, hated life. It wanted the cold eternity of the void. Irving began to turn every valve, to pull every lever, sending a torrent of heat through the pipes, flooding the hotel with a false, furious summer. The hotel screamed. It was a sound of bending timber, of shattering glass, of 1,000 whispers rising to a shriek. The vines on the walls withered. The figures blurred and faded. The corridor snapped back to its normal length. In the basement, Ernesto stood before the foundation stone, the axe raised. The malevolence within him fought the sudden, invasive warmth, a war of temperatures in his soul. For a second, his own eyes flickered back. He saw his son's small, determined face in his mind. He saw Linda's tears. With a final, titanic effort of a will he thought long lost, he turned the axe inward. The epilogue was a fade to white. They found him there. The crisis passed. The hotel, wounded, retreated into dormancy. It was over. But not really. They left in the spring, when the thaw came and the first park service crew arrived. They never spoke of it. Linda held Irving close in the back seat of their car as they wound down the mountain. Ernesto drove, his hand steady on the wheel, his eyes clear. But he never looked in the rearview mirror. He was afraid of what or who might be looking back. Irving sat quietly. He could still feel it. A faint, cold thread tied to a place deep inside him. A thread that stretched back up the mountain to the overlook. Ibrahim was gone, but the road was still there. And locks, he knew, could be picked from the outside too. Years later, Irving would be a man, sitting in a quiet room of his own. He would feel a sudden, familiar chill. He would look at the window and see, not his reflection, but the faint, ghostly pattern of that old burgundy carpet superimposed on the wall. He would hear, in the hum of the refrigerator, the distant, rhythmic thud of a waltz. And he would know, with a calm and terrible certainty, that the hotel remembered, that it was patient, that it was dreaming of him, and in the dream he was always a child, standing at the end of a long, long corridor, and the door at the end was opening, not to let him out, but to let something in. The image would grow blurred then, the edges softening, the details melting away like a photograph left in the rain, until there was only the echo of the wind, and the faint, sweet smell of old wood and forgotten parties, and then nothing at all. The thread never broke. It thinned over the years, a spider-silk tether, but it held. Irving became a historian of quiet places, a cataloger of whispers. He married a woman with a laugh like sunlight, and they had a daughter who dreamed of volcanoes and dinosaurs, not silent hotels. He built a life of solid, ordinary things, a fortress against the cold. But he kept a map, and on it, one location was marked with a small, precise X. Not the overlook itself, but the geographical anomaly noted in the original surveyor's reports. A place where compass needles spun lazily, and the granite seemed to hum. Ernesto died when Irving was 32. It was a quick, merciful heart attack in his garden. At the funeral, under a benign blue sky, Linda finally spoke of it. She took Irving's hand, her own papery and light. "He never slept right again," she said, her voice steady. "He'd get up and check all the doors and windows, every night, even here." She looked at the coffin being lowered into the earth. He locked it away. But a lock is a reminder of what's inside. Her words were the key to a door in his own mind. That night, for the first time in decades, the dream returned. Not the fragmented sensations, but the full, terrible narrative. He was in the corridor, the burgundy knots twisting like snakes, the cold air tasting of ozone and champagne. The door at the end was open a crack, and a sliver of impossible blackness pulsed within. He woke, not with a gasp, but with a deep, resigned exhale. It was an invitation, or a summons. The overlook had been sold, renovated, rebranded. It was now the Grand Rocky Peak Retreat and Spa. The website boasted of a state-of-the-art geothermal system and mindfulness workshops. The old boiler was a museum piece in the lobby. Irving booked a weekend under a false name. Driving up the mountain road was a descent into memory. Every switchback was familiar. When the hotel came into view, it was both the same and utterly different. New windows gleamed. The timber had been stained a cheerful amber, but the shape of it, the way it crouched in the mountain's palm, was unchanged. It still overlooked. It still waited. He checked in. The lobby was all light wood and alpine chic, but the floor was the same. They had sanded and refinished the old boards, but the endless carpet with its interlocking knots was gone, replaced by tasteful slate tile. Yet as he stood at the front desk, he felt a faint, familiar vibration through his soles. The deep, subaudible hum. The road was still there. His room was in the west wing. Not the old staff quarters, but a premium suite with a view of the peaks. He set his bag down and immediately went to the wall, placing his palm flat against it. The plaster was cool and smooth. He closed his eyes, listening not with his ears, but with the old sense Ibrahim had helped him hone. At first, nothing. The buzz of a minibar, the distant chime of an elevator. Then, beneath it, a slow, viscous drip of feeling. Not the red static of jealousy or the blue hum of despair. This was newer, subtler, a gray, anxious buzz. The hotel was feeding on different fare now, the quiet desperation of a businessman who'd lost a deal, the sharp jealousy of a wife watching her husband glance at the yoga instructor, the low-grade fear of a CEO trying to meditate. It was a diet of minor miseries, but it was enough. He spent the afternoon walking the halls. The Gold Room was now a juice bar. The Colorado Lounge was a co-working space. The ballroom, where he had seen the waltzing shadows, was a conference center, set up for a corporate team-building seminar. He stood at the threshold. The checkerboard floor was hidden under industrial carpeting, but when the overhead lights were off and only the exit signs glowed, he could almost see it. He took the elevator down to the basement. The new geothermal plant hummed cleanly behind a glass wall, but past it, a door marked Historical Infrastructure was locked on. He knew it led to the old boiler room, to the sub-basement, to the foundation stone. He pressed his forehead against the cool metal of the door. A wave of nausea hit him, a smell of hot grease and dry rot that wasn't physically present. The thing down there was sleeping, but it was dreaming. And in its dream, it tasted his familiar fear, a vintage it had long missed. That night, he sat by his window, watching the stars over the peaks. He had come to sever the thread, to face the place as an adult and prove it held no power. But he felt smaller, not larger. The hotel had grown around him, incorporating its new shell. But its heart was the same ancient, hungry stone. He must have dozed off in the chair. The sound that woke him was not a shudder or a thud. It was the crisp, clear sound of a crayon on paper. He turned. Sitting cross-legged on his perfectly made bed was a boy. He was about 9, with hair the color of wheat and eyes that were too dark. He was drawing on a sheet of hotel stationery. He did not look up. Irving's breath froze. This was not a memory. This was new. "They told me you'd come back," the boy said, his voice soft and conversational. He held up the drawing. It was the hotel, but with a single tall figure standing in front of it. The figure had no face, just a swirl of black lines. From the figure's chest, a single red thread stretched out of the page toward Irving. "They've been waiting. They're almost strong enough again. Who are you?" Irving managed to ask. The boy finally looked at him, and his smile was a perfect empty curve. "I'm the new key." He tilted his head. "They learned from your father. Anger is loud. It burns out. Loneliness. Loneliness is quiet. It lasts." He went back to his drawing, adding tiny, black buzzing insects around the windows. They like that I'm quiet. The boy began to fade, not with a blur, but by becoming transparent, like a photograph dissolving in water. The last thing to vanish was the drawing, which floated for a second in the air before fluttering to the bedspread. Irving reached for it, but as his fingers touched the paper, it crumbled into a fine gray ash that smelled of cold soil. He sat there until dawn, the thread inside him pulled taut. He had not come to conquer a memory. He had walked into a new story and the first page was already written. The hotel was not just dreaming of the past. It was cultivating its future. And down in the dark, behind the locked door, the foundation stone was listening, and it was very, very hungry. Yeah, Dor said no. Story 4. The hallway in Kate's apartment was a study in quiet geometry, a rectangle of worn oak floorboards and pale gray walls that held the evening light like a held breath. It was a familiar space, a neutral conduit between bedroom and living room, kitchen and bath. Yet that evening, as she walked its length to fetch a glass of water, she felt a subtle wrongness. It was not in anything she could immediately name, not a shifted picture frame or a new crack in the plaster. It was in the way the shadows pooled at the far end, near the closet door. They seemed too deep, too still, as if they were not an absence of light, but a substance of their own, a viscous ink that had seeped from the narrow gap beneath the door. The air there tasted different, too. A faint, sweet, rotten scent, like forgotten sachets in a grandmother's drawer, layered over the dried dust of the heater. She paused, her hand on the cool plaster wall, and felt the silence thicken around her. It was the silence of a held secret. She shook her head, a quick, bird-like motion, and turned away, attributing it to fatigue, to the lingering stress of her sessions with Jameer. But the wrongness lingered, a splinter in the corner of her mind. The bear sat propped against the pillows on her bed, as it had for 30 years. His name was Barnaby, a relic of a childhood she remembered only in smeared watercolor impressions. He was a tan creature, his mohair worn bald in patches, one black eye button hanging by a thread, his smile a stitched red gash that had long since faded to pink. He was comfort. He was background. He was the one constant from a household, a family scattered, a life rebuilt. Jameer, with his calm voice and notebooks of clean white paper, had fixated on Barnaby. The anchor, he called him. A symbol of frozen self. You speak of a numbness, Kate. A flatness. You have curated this adult life with such care, but you feel like a guest within it. Sometimes to move forward, we must respectfully let go of the objects that chain us to old weather. He suggested a ritual, a thanking, a release. Perhaps, he had said gently, it was time to put Barnaby away, or even, when she was ready, to destroy him. The idea was a cold stone in her gut. She could not explain why. It was just a toy. The first tear happened by accident. A week after the hallway first felt wrong, she was changing the linens. As she lifted Barnaby, her thumbnail caught on a loose thread at his side seam. It gave way with a soft sighing sound, not a snap but a relinquishment. A small puff of grayish material, not white cotton batting, drifted out. It settled on the new blue sheet like a tiny ghost. Curious, she picked at the hole. The material inside was not uniform. It was fibrous, clumped and dark in places. It smelled, unmistakably now, of that same sweet decay from the hallway, but with a metallic undertone, like old pennies and damp soil. A profound revulsion, swift and irrational, swept through her. She dropped the bear as if it had grown hot. He landed on his back, his single good eye staring at the ceiling, the small tear gaping like a wound. That night, the dreams began. Not dreams precisely. They were memories, but memories experienced with a brutal, sensory immediacy that her waking recollections utterly lacked. She was Madison again, 7 years old, in the kitchen of the old house on Elm Down. The linoleum was cold and sticky under her bare feet. The air was thick with the smell of burned bacon and her father's cigarette smoke, which clung to the yellow curtains. She could feel the specific, scratchy texture of the chair upholstery against her legs, and she could feel, as a physical weight in her small chest, a crushing, wordless despair. Her mother was crying at the table, a silent, shaking misery, while her father's voice, a low rumble from the living room, argued with someone on the phone. The emotion was too big for her body. It had no name. It was simply a bad feeling. In the dream memory, little Madison clutched Barnaby to her face, burying her tears in his fur, and she whispered into his cloth ear, "You take it. You hold it for me." And the feeling lessened. It drained from her into the bear. She woke, gasping, the taste of salt and smoke and that childhood despair coating her tongue. She told Jameer about the dream, but not the stuffing. She described the intensity, the smell. He leaned forward, his glasses catching the light. That is a powerful recollection. The mind stores trauma in sensory packages. The bear is a key, Kate. It unlocks the room where you stored what you could not process. This is progress, painful but necessary. But it was not a memory being unlocked. It was being released. The tear in Barnaby's side grew, not from further tampering, but as if the seam itself was unraveling, yielding to the pressure of what was within. The strange stuffing bulged slightly, a grayish, granular mastoc, and the apartment changed. The wrongness in the hallway intensified. The deep shadow by the closet door now seemed to pulse, very slowly, with a rhythm like a sleeping thing's breath. The sweet, rotten smell permeated everything, clinging to her clothes, her hair. Sounds became distorted. The drip of the kitchen faucet would sometimes elongate into a series of wet, guttural clicks. The hum of the refrigerator would drop into a sub-auditory register that vibrated in her molars. Then came the anger. It struck her one Tuesday afternoon as she was sorting mail. A misplaced bill, a trivial thing, and a rage so pure and white-hot erupted in her skull that she drove her fist through the drywall beside the door. She stood there, breath heaving, knuckles bleeding, shocked at the violence of it. The emotion felt foreign, yet intimately familiar. It was her father's rage, the one that used to make the old house tremble, but it was also hers, a child's furious, impotent anger at a world of weeping mothers and slamming doors. It had been in her all along. Barnaby had held it, and now, with his stitching failing, it was leaking back into her atmosphere. She confronted the bear. She lifted him from the bed. He was heavier than he should be. Holding her breath, she inserted 2 fingers into the torn seam and pulled. The fabric parted with a series of tiny, protesting pops. The stuffing cascaded out, not in a fluffy cloud, but in a damp, clotted stream. It was a conglomerate of things. Grayish wool, yes, but tangled with what looked like fine, dark hair. Brittle leaves, granules of rust, and knotted threads the color of dried blood. And nestled within it, solid and cold, were objects. A small, smooth stone from the creek behind her childhood home, a tarnished silver button, a shard of milk glass from a broken vase, a tiny fabric heart sewn with clumsy, childish stitches. Each one was a cyst, a hardened shell around a moment of pure childhood feeling. The entity was not a ghost, not a demon. It was the preserved emotional mass itself, given a kind of sentience by its long containment and its sheer concentrated potency. It coalesced in the apartment, not as a shape, but as a pervasive influence. It was the crawling cold that started in the hallway and spread. It was the way the light would dim and yellow, casting the rooms in the pallid, sickly hue of a forgotten photograph. It was the whispers that were not quite sounds, but the echoes of her own past thoughts, thrown back at her from the walls. I'm scared. Make it stop. I hate you. Why doesn't anyone love me? The closet door in the hallway would now stand open a crack, regardless of how many times she closed it. Within, the darkness was absolute, and from it breathed the full, terrifying scent of the past. Mothballs, mildew, and the ozone smell of a coming storm. Kate stopped seeing Jameer. His world of careful analysis and ritualistic release had no vocabulary for this. This was not psychology. This was alchemy of the worst kind. She tried to gather the spilled stuffing, to stuff it back into the bear's limp body, but the material seemed to repel her hands, feeling alternately freezing cold and unpleasantly warm. The more that spilled out, the more Madison, not as a memory, but as a desperate, emotional presence, seemed to bleed into the world. But Kate would catch glimpses in the warped reflection of the toaster, a small, pale face with huge, lost eyes. She would feel a small, cold hand slip into hers as she lay paralyzed in the hour before dawn. The climax was not a battle, but a suffocation. It happened on a night of still air and a bloated moon. The apartment was no longer her own. The walls seemed to have absorbed the sadness, sweating a damp, melancholic chill. The anger hung in the air like static, making her hair stand on end. The fear was a taste, coppery and sharp, on the back of her tongue. She stood in the hallway, facing the open closet door. From within the darkness, she could hear the quiet, hitched sobs of a child. Her own sobs. They pulled at her, a terrible, gravitational longing. She knew what she had to do. Not to destroy the bear, but to reclaim what was hers. To ingest her own poison. She walked into the closet darkness. It was not a closet. It was the heart of the old house on Elm. She felt the shag carpet, saw the stripe of light under a different door, heard the raised, blurred voices of her parents. And she felt it all, the crushing despair, the clawing fear, the bitter anger, swirling around her, seeking a vessel. The child Madison was there, a silhouette of pure need, holding out the empty, deflated skin of Barnaby. Kate did not embrace her. She opened herself. She stopped fighting the emotions as they flooded back. She let the childhood terror scream in her veins. She let the ancient anger clench her fists. She let the profound sadness bow her shoulders and rack her with silent tears. She took it all back. It was agony. It was annihilation. It was the most honest moment of her life. When it was over, she was on her knees in her own, perfectly ordinary closet, among her shoes and winter coats. The cold was gone. The smells were gone. The silence was just silence. On the floor before her lay Barnaby, empty, a flat pelt of fabric and button eyes. The strange stuffing was gone, dissipated into nothing, its energy repatriated. In the weeks that followed, a kind of peace settled upon Kate. The numbness was gone. She felt everything now. The sharp beauty of the morning light, the pang of a remembered melody, the slow burn of genuine irritation. The emotions were intense, often overwhelming, but they were hers. They were fluid. They passed. She was real to herself in a way she had never been. She kept the empty skin of Barnaby. She placed him on a shelf in the living room, a curious artifact. One afternoon, while dusting, she picked him up. He was impossibly light. On a whim, she held him to her face, as she had as Madison so long ago. And from within the hollow fabric cavity, soft as a breath but unmistakable, came a sound. It was not a sob, not a whisper. It was a sigh of profound, eternal relief. And then, very faintly, the sound of a second heartbeat, slow and steady, echoing from the empty space where the stuffing had been, keeping time with her own. She lowered the bear. She looked at the empty hallway, clean and neutral in the afternoon sun. She placed a hand over her own heart, feeling its rhythm. She listened. In the quiet apartment, she could not tell where her heartbeat ended and the other began. She sat there, holding the hollow shell, and knew the work was not finished. It had only just begun. The vessel was empty, yes, but a vessel, once used, always retains the shape of what it held. And some shapes are hungry to be filled again. The sigh lingered in the air, a thread of sound that seemed to weave itself into the quiet of the room. Kate sat very still, the empty bear in her lap, and listened to the twin rhythm. It was not an echo. It was a separate, living pulse, a soft counterpoint to her own that emanated from the hollow cavity of fabric. It was comforting, in a way that was deeply unsettling. This was not the invasive presence of before. This was something new, a shared space. She began to notice other things. The air in the apartment no longer carried the taste of old storms, but sometimes, in a moment of quiet, she would catch a scent that had no source. The crisp, clean smell of snow or the green tang of crushed grass. Once, waking from a deep sleep, she was certain she heard the distant, joyful shriek of a child that was not a memory, but a sound happening just outside the realm of the present. Barnaby remained on the shelf. She could not bring herself to dispose of him. He was a part of her anatomy now, a second, silent heart. She found herself speaking to him sometimes, not in the desperate whispers of childhood, but in simple, declarative sentences. The meeting was exhausting, she would say, placing her keys on the table. Or that man at the coffee shop smiled at me. It felt less like talking to a toy, and more like vocalizing a thought to make it real, to share the weight of it. And sometimes, in response, the air would feel lighter, or the faint, sympathetic heartbeat from the shelf would seem to slow, as if in understanding. She started painting again. She hadn't touched her brushes in years, the urge flattened by the same numbness that had claimed everything else. Now, colors screamed for her attention. She bought a large canvas and began without a plan. What emerged was not a scene, but a field of texture and deep, resonant color. Layers of umber and slate blue, shot through with veins of gold and a startling, visceral red. It was the emotional landscape of her last few months. It was beautiful and terrible. She called it Vessel. One evening, as she was cleaning her brushes, the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Henderson from across the hall, a kind woman in her 70s who kept to herself. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "I'm so sorry to bother you, Kate," she said, wringing her hands. "It's my cat, Mitten. He's gone. Just slipped out this afternoon. I've looked everywhere." Her voice broke. "He's all I have." Kate felt a surge of empathetic pain, sharp and clear. Before she could offer to help search, a strange certainty settled over her. "Wait here," she said. She walked to the living room shelf and took Barnaby down. She didn't know why. She carried the empty bear to the door and, on an impulse she could not explain, pressed it gently into Mrs. Henderson's hands. "Hold this for a minute," Kate said. The old woman looked bewildered, but cradled the soft fabric automatically. She took a shuddering breath, her tears falling onto the bald mohair. "Oh, you poor dear," she murmured. Whether to Kate or the bear wasn't clear. She stood there for a long minute, just holding it, her shoulders slowly relaxing from their tense hunch. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson was at her door again, beaming. Mitten had been found curled on the doormat at dawn, as if he had never been away. She handed Barnaby back with profound thanks. "I don't know what it was," she said, her eyes clear and bright, "but holding this silly old thing just made me feel hopeful, like I could breathe again." Kate took the bear back. It felt warm, and as she closed the door, she heard it. A new sound, woven into the steady, dual heartbeat. A faint, contented purr. A cold understanding dawned. Barnaby was not just a receptacle for her own emotions. He had been transformed by the ritual of reclamation. He was no longer a prison. He was a crucible, a filter. He could take the raw, overwhelming ache of another, the sharp, lonely fear of Mrs. Henderson, and hold it, soften it, transmute it into something bearable. He had taken a sip of her neighbor's grief and given back a sigh of relief. The implications unfurled in her mind, both wondrous and terrifying. She thought of Jameer, of his talk of anchors and chains. He had been wrong, but also right. She had not let go. She had integrated. And in doing so, she had changed the nature of the anchor entirely. It was no longer a weight holding her to the ocean floor. It had become a buoy, capable of bearing weight for others. She looked at the empty bear, then at her painting, that chaotic map of feeling. The hollow was not a void. It was a potential. A space waiting to be filled, not with the poison of a trapped past, but with the shared, temporary sorrows of the present. It was a gift of terrifying power, and she knew, with a certainty that echoed in the now synchronized beating of their two hearts, that she would have to use it. The world was full of shadows pooling in hallways. She had simply been given a new way to see them, and a strange, soft tool with which to gently wipe them away. The work, indeed, had only just begun. The first intentional test was with a colleague at work, Mark, whose father was in hospice. Kate saw the glassy, distant look in his eyes, the way he moved through the office like a ghost. She invited him for coffee, and when he spoke, his words were a choked monotone of logistical details: flights, wills, medications. The raw terror and grief were trapped beneath, a geyser waiting to erupt. "Can I show you something strange?" Kate asked when he fell silent. She pulled Barnaby from her bag. She'd taken to carrying him in a simple canvas tote. "Humor me. Just hold him for a second." Mark gave a weak, bewildered smile, but took the bear. His hands were trembling. He looked down at the button eyes, and his expression of polite confusion slowly melted. His shoulders slumped. He drew a long, ragged breath that sounded like the first real breath he'd taken in weeks. "God," he whispered, I forgot what it felt like to not be holding all that." He didn't cry. He just sat, holding the bear, for 5 full minutes. When he handed it back, he looked exhausted but present. "What is that? Some kind of therapeutic toy?" "Something like that," Kate said. The bear felt heavier in her hands, dense with a cold, sorrowful weight that slowly dissipated over the next hour, leaving behind only that steady, purring heartbeat. She learned the rules through trial and error. The bear could only hold so much. It was not a bottomless pit. It was a cup. She had to empty it, a process she discovered instinctively. She would sit with Barnaby in her lap, place her hands over his hollow center, and simply acknowledge what was there. "This is Mark's fear," she would say quietly. "This is the sorrow for his father." And as she named it, the emotion would diffuse, not into her, but into the air, becoming neutral, like weather passing. The bear would grow light again. But the world, she found, was endlessly, creatively full of pain. A barista with a black eye flinching at a slammed door. A friend mourning a miscarriage. A stranger on the bus weeping silently into his phone. Kate began to see a spectrum of shadows clinging to people, hues of blue and gray and sickly green. And she felt a pull, a magnetic need to approach, to offer the bear. The relief on their faces was instant, profound, addictive. She became a secret saint, a silent siphon. She wandered the city, a hollow bear in her bag, drawn to pockets of concentrated anguish. A hospital waiting room became a feast. A protest march a symphony of anger she could gently tap. She felt powerful, purposeful. The dual heartbeat was a constant, comforting drum. The sound of her own amplified capacity. The change in her was noticeable. People described her as deeply calm, radiantly empathetic. They flocked to her, unburdening themselves without knowing why. She collected their shadows, and Barnaby held them. She was so busy lightening the loads of others that she failed to notice the subtle shift in her own atmosphere. The smells returned first. Not decay, but the specific, cloying perfumes of strangers, a patient's medicinal rub, the sharp alcohol of a grieving widow's scent, the stale beer on a homeless man's breath. These odors lingered in her apartment long after the bear had been emptied. Then, the sounds. She began to hear faint, overlapping whispers in the quiet hours, fragments of other people's prayers and curses. God, don't let him die. I hate you, I hate you. Please, just one more chance. She was not reclaiming these emotions. She was filtering them, but the filter was becoming saturated. Residue remained. A psychic silt was building up in her life in the very walls of her home. One rainy Thursday, a young woman stopped her on the street, drawn to Kate like a magnet. She was shivering, her story a torrent of loss, a fired job, a broken engagement, a sick pet. Kate, moved by the sheer volume of it, let her hold Barnaby for a long time. The woman sobbed, the bear absorbing a tsunami of compounded despair. When she walked away, she looked born again. But that night, the bear would not lighten. Kate sat with him for hours, but the cold, desperate weight remained stubbornly solid. And when she slept, she did not dream her own dreams. She dreamed the young woman's dreams, chaotic, panicked scenes of falling, of being chased, of endless, empty rooms. She woke feeling a stranger's despair as her own. It was the old numbness, but worse, a borrowed bleakness. She looked at Barnaby on the bedside table. The single, shiny button eye seemed to watch her. Not with malevolence, but with a kind of passive, empty expectation. The heartbeat from within his fabric chest was no longer in sync with hers. It was faster, a frantic, bird-like flutter. He was not just a vessel for what she put in him. He was developing a taste. The hollow was not just a space. It was a mouth, and she had been feeding it. The realization was a different kind of cold, one that went deeper than any childhood memory. She had not contained her own poison. She had simply turned her childhood coping mechanism into a vocation. She was still a little girl whispering, "You take it." But now she was saying it to everyone. And the bear's capacity and its appetite had grown. She took Barnaby from the shelf and held him at arm's length. The sigh she heard now was not one of relief. It was the sound of wind through a deep, dark canyon, a hungry sound. She had believed the work was to fill the vessel with the world's sorrows. She saw now, with a clarity that turned her bones to ice, that the real work was to learn how to let the vessel sit empty, and to let people, including herself, carry their own weight. The hollow could not be allowed to hunger. It had to be taught to be still. But as the frantic heartbeat pulsed against her palms, she wondered if it was already too late for that. Story 5. The wallpaper in the guest room was cold to the touch, a damp, velvet cold that seemed to seep up from the plaster beneath, through the faded floral pattern, and into the pads of Christie's fingers. It was not the chill of neglect, for she dusted this room every Tuesday, but something deeper, a subterranean coolness that lived in the walls of Blackwater House. She pressed her palm flat against it, as if taking a fever, and felt the faint, almost imperceptible pulse of the old estate, a heartbeat of damp stone and rotting timber. She was still there, hand against the wall, when Damon's truck crunched on the gravel drive. He did not come alone. A woman stepped from the passenger side, and the afternoon light, thin and watery as it was in the Maine autumn, seemed to shy away from her. She was all contrast. Hair the black of a starless midnight, skin so pale it appeared translucent, like paper over a candle flame. "Her name was Alicia," Damon said, his voice gruffer than usual. "A friend from the city needing quiet. A place to rest." Blackwater was built for quiet. It sat in a bowl of pine and fir, the lake at its back a sheet of tarnished silver. The long driveway its only tether to a world that felt to Christie like a story she'd read once and forgotten. Damon, her uncle and guardian since her parents' quiet, feverish deaths a decade prior, was a man of few words and many repairs. The house was a patient they both tended, its needs a language they shared. Alicia entered their silent lexicon like a new and unsettling symbol. She did not rest. She wandered. Christie would see her from the kitchen window, a slash of black wool against the gray-green of the woods, moving with a fluid, soundless grace. She appeared in rooms without the warning of a footstep. A presence felt first as a drop in temperature, a scent of ozone and dried roses. She was drawn to Christie, her attention a soft, focused weight. "You feel it too, don't you?" Alicia said one evening. They were in the library, the fire struggling against the creeping damp. Her voice was a low, melodic hum. "The life of the house. It's not just boards and nails. It's a vessel. It remembers." Christie, who had never articulated the feeling but lived with it daily, could only nod. A confidential bond formed, spun from shared glances and half-finished sentences. Alicia spoke of ancient things, of histories written in blood and shadow, not with horror, but with a wistful familiarity. She never ate at mealtimes but would sip dark tea, her eyes watching Christie over the rim of the cup, luminous and knowing. Damon watched too, from a distance, his brow furrowed, his hands often clenched. He began to smell of worried sweat, and the sharp tang of the garlic he hung in braids from the kitchen beams, a new habit he offered no explanation for. The first illness was a subtle thing. Old Mrs. Peabody from the nearest farm, 3 miles down the lake road, took to her bed with a profound anemia, speaking of beautiful, troubling dreams. Then the Henderson boy, normally robust, was found listless on the shore, his skin cool, 2 small bruised punctures on his neck he claimed were from a bat. A strange lassitude settled over the scattered community, accompanied by a shared dream of a dark lady who offered comfort from the cold. Bobby Treadway, who ran the general store and had carried a torch for Christie since grade school, was not a dreamer. He was a practical man, and the practical facts worried him. The sudden arrival of the striking stranger, the cluster of unexplained sickens, the pallor that was deepening on Christie's own cheeks, a pallor that looked less like illness and more like a slow transformation into something porcelain and fragile. He saw the way she looked at Alicia, with a devotion that bordered on hunger, and he saw the way Damon watched them both. A man guarding a door he feared was already open. "Something's not right in that house, Christie," Bobby said, cornering her by the lake one afternoon. The water was still, a mirror to the leaden sky. "People are getting sick. You're getting quiet." "It's just the season, Bobby. The quiet of the land." Her voice was distant, echoing Alicia's cadence. "It's not the land," he insisted, his voice cracking. "It's her. Damon knows it. Why do you think he's got garlic hanging like Christmas tinsel?" "He's reading old books, Christie. Books about old folk ways, protection." Christie felt a flicker of her old self, a spark of fear. She remembered the cold pulse in the wall, the way Alicia never cast a reflection in the dark lake water when they walked at dusk. The taste of the tea she was given, metallic and rich, that left her feeling stronger yet strangely hollow. That night, the revelation came not with a scream, but with a sigh. Christie, sleepwalking through the moonlit halls, drawn like a compass needle, found the door to the guest room ajar. Inside, Alicia was not sleeping. She stood by the window, the moonlight not falling upon her, but seeming to gather within her. A vessel of cold radiance. And she was not alone. Damon lay on the bed, his body rigid, his eyes wide open and glazed with terror. Alicia's head was bent to his throat, not in a violent puncture, but in an intimate, terrible kiss, a slow, deliberate communion. The sound was not a suck, but a soft, rhythmic sigh, the sound of a tide pulling relentlessly at the shore. Christie did not cry out. The horror was too absolute, too serene. It was the secret heartbeat of the house made manifest. This was the life it remembered. This was the quiet it kept. Alicia lifted her head. Damon's chest rose and fell, shallow and weak. A single dark tear of blood traced a path from the corner of his mouth. Alicia turned to Christie, her lips stained not red, but black in the moonlight. She smiled, and it was a smile of infinite sorrow and recognition. "You see," Alicia whispered, her voice the rustle of dead leaves in the deep woods. "It's not about death. It's about preservation. An eternal quiet. A forever house. He fights it, but his blood remembers the pact his grandfather made. This land, this house, has always hungered. I am just its current custodian. And you are its perfect heir. You've always felt the cold. You've always heard the quiet. Let me show you how to drink it in." Bobby came the next day, armed with a crucifix from his grandmother, and a desperate, foolish courage. He found the house silent. He found Damon in his workshop, moving slowly, methodically planing a piece of oak, his face ashen, 2 livid marks on his neck now openly visible. He would not meet Bobby's eyes. "Christie's gone walking with her guest," Damon said, his voice a dry husk. "Don't go looking. The woods are deep, but..." Bobby did look. He followed the path to the old family cemetery, a forgotten plot of leaning stones swallowed by moss. There, he found Christie. She stood beside Alicia, who seemed less a woman and more a statue carved from moonshadow. Christie turned to him. Her face was serene, beautiful in a way that stopped his heart. The last of her color was gone, replaced by that radiant, translucent pallor. Her eyes, once the warm brown of the forest floor, held a new distant light, like stars seen from the bottom of a well. "Bobby," she said, and her voice was a perfect, gentle echo of Alicia's melodic hum-hum. "You should go. The dark comes early now." He stumbled back, the crucifix heavy and foolish in his hand. He saw no fangs, no monstrous transformation, only the profound, chilling quiet of the place settling into Christie, filling the spaces where her warmth had been. She was becoming a vessel for it. The story Bobby told was incoherent, a jumble of pale skin and cemetery mist and a look in Christie's eyes that wasn't hers. The doctor called it shock. The sheriff found nothing. Damon offered no defense, just continued his repairs on the endless, patient house. Christie did not return to the store, or to the lake, or to the world. She and Alicia became features of the landscape, seen sometimes at twilight from a distance, 2 still figures against the darkening pines. The strange illnesses in the area ceased, replaced by pervasive, unshakable fatigue, a collective sigh of resignation. The land itself grew quieter, the birdsong thinner, the wind softer, as if the very air was being slowly, gently consumed. Years later, a hiker lost his way near Blackwater. As night fell, he saw a light in the great house and approached, hoping for direction. Through the grand, uncurtained window of the library, he saw a fire burning low. 2 women sat before it, one dark, one fair, both impossibly, agelessly still. They were reading from the same large old book. The fair one, who seemed so young yet so ancient, looked up. She did not see him, but looked past him into the deep, nourishing dark beyond the glass. And she smiled a small, secret smile, the smile of someone listening to a beloved, familiar song, a song only she could hear, the slow, sighing rhythm of the quiet and the cold and the forever house. The hiker stumbled back from the window, his breath pluming in the air, though it was only early fall. The silence around the house was a physical pressure, a thick velvet muffling the crunch of his own retreating footsteps. He did not find the main road until dawn, and when he finally did, he could not recall the exact path he had taken, nor the precise features of the women in the window. The memory had the quality of a dream, persistent, but without sharp edges, leaving him only with a profound thirst and a tiredness in his bones that lasted for weeks. In Blackwater House, Christie turned a page. The paper was dry and whispered like a skin shedding. She no longer needed to read the words. She knew them by the taste they left in the air. A taste of iron and loam. The fire was not for warmth, but for the dance of light. A mimicry of life she observed with detached curiosity. Alicia had grown even stiller, a statue in the chair opposite, her eyes closed. She was feeding less and less, sinking deeper into a torpor that was not sleep, but a profound listening. The house was nearly full. Damon was the bellwether. Christie could feel him moving through the rooms below, a slow, steady pulse of resigned vitality. He was the last true heartbeat in the walls, the final anchor to the turning world. The pact his grandfather had made, trading a bloodline for the preservation of the land and the house, was nearing its completion. Damon's will, his stubborn, garlic-tinged resistance, had stretched the process out over years. But he was tired now. Christie could feel his tiredness in the way the floorboards sighed, in the reluctant groan of the pump handle. He was coming to see the quiet, not as a theft, but as a mercy. Bobby Treadway never married. He took over the store fully from his ailing father and ran it with a kind of grim competence. He avoided looking down the lake road. Every autumn, when the lassitude settled over the community, he would hang extra garlic by the door and keep a pot of strong coffee brewing. Though it did little to lift the fog, he had seen the change in Christie, and it had changed him, carving a hollow in him that he filled with work and silence. He understood, in a way the others did not, that what was happening was not an invasion, but a homecoming. The land was reclaiming its own, and Blackwater House was its open mouth. The evening Damon finally lay down in his own bed, knowing he would not rise. Christie came to him. Alicia remained in the library, a sentinel of satisfied hunger. Christie sat on the edge of the bed, her hand cool on his forehead. He looked up at her, not with terror, but with a weary recognition. "It's done, isn't it?" he rasped. "Almost," she said, her voice the soft sound of dust settling. "The house thanks you. Your vigil is over." He nodded, a small movement. "Your parents, they feared this. They tried to leave. The fever that took them. It wasn't like the doctors said." "I know," Christie said. The house had shown her in whispers. The frantic packing, the sudden weakness, the way the very air of Blackwater had seemed to thicken in their lungs to stop them. They had been corrected. She was not. She was chosen. When his breathing shallowed into nothing, there was no dramatic death rattle. It was simply a cessation, a final exhalation that seemed to seep into the walls, enriching the silence. The cold pulse in the wallpaper grew stronger, a steady, contented thrum. Christie felt it resonate through her, a completing chord. She closed his eyes and sat with him until the moon rose, not in grief, but in observance. He was part of the house now, forever. The next morning, the for sale sign appeared at the head of the driveway. The realtor, a cheerful woman from Bangor, found it impossible to get any local to show the property. She brought clients herself, but they never made an offer. They complained of a damp chill no furnace could touch, and a feeling of being watched from the woods. The house never sold. Christy and Alicia remained. With Damon's passing, the last thread of resistance snapped. The quiet deepened, perfected. The perimeter of the land grew subtly indistinct, the driveway slowly reclaimed by brambles and young pine. The world, bit by bit, forgot the way in. On clear nights, if someone had been there to see, they might observe two pale figures walking the shore of the tarnished lake. They cast no reflection. They spoke, if they spoke at all, in a language below hearing. They were the keepers of the quiet, the vessels of the forever house. And in the library, the fire burned low, forever, illuminating empty chairs that were not empty at all, but perfectly, eternally occupied. The seasons turned, but within the bowl of pines, time became a circular, shallow thing. Christy learned to listen to the new silences. The creak of a floorboard was a sentence. The patter of rain on the slate roof was a chapter in a long, slow story. She and Alicia moved through the rooms as twin currents of still air, their needs diminishing to the point of abstraction. The hunger was not gone, but it was dormant, a satisfied beast sleeping in the foundation. The land, having consumed the vitality of the Blackwater line, now rested, sated, and dreamless. Christy found she could hear the memories in the walls, not as echoes, but as present, gentle truths. She could sit in the parlor and feel the ghost of a summer party from 1892. The laughter now a soft, dry rustling. The warmth of it just a faint, remembered pressure against her skin. She learned the names of the trees from the whispers of the sap slowing in their veins. She understood the migration of the geese overhead, not as a journey, but as a distant, rhythmic exhalation of a world that still turned far away. Bobby Treadway died the winter after Damon. A stroke, they said, in the back room of the store. When Christy felt the small, sharp snap of his passing, like a twig breaking under snow, she walked to the edge of the property line and stood for a long time, looking toward the distant glow of the town. She felt nothing she could name as sorrow. It was more like noting the closing of a book she had read long ago. His resistance had been a kind of seasoning, a bitter herb that made the ensuing quiet all the more profound. Alicia began to fade. It was a gradual dissolution, not a death. She would sit for days in the same chair, her form growing less distinct, as if she were becoming a portrait of herself painted on the air. One evening, as the first star pricked the violet sky, she spoke for the last time. "It is complete," she said, her voice the faintest tremor in the stillness. "The house has its true mistress. My vigil is ended." Christy took her hand. It was cool and weightless, like holding a bundle of dried lavender. "Where will you go?" "Nowhere. Everywhere. Back into the quiet." Alicia's dark eyes held Christy's for a moment, and in them was neither love nor malice, but a perfect, finished understanding. "You are the house now. Tend it well. May ye." By morning, Alicia was gone. Not gone away, but gone into. The velvet drapes held her absence. The specific cold spot in the guest room dissipated, spreading evenly through the entire structure. Christy was alone, and yet she had never been less alone. Every nail, every pane of glass, every stone in the foundation was a cell of her own body. She let the woods advance. Briars climbed the porch columns. Moss softened the steps. The for sale sign fell and was buried in fern and leaf litter. The world's busyness receded, its sounds fading to a faint, oceanic murmur beyond the ridge. People still told stories, of course. Blackwater House became a staple of local ghost lore, a cautionary tale for teenagers. Occasionally, a daring soul would venture down the overgrown driveway, but none reached the house. They would become confused, their compasses spinning, overcome by a sudden, crushing fatigue. They would wake at the roadside, miles away, with no memory of the journey back. Only a deep, unshakable chill, and the urgent need to go home and lock the door. Christie felt these intrusions as one might feel a flea on thick hide, a tiny, irrelevant itch. She spent her endless days in a state of serene perception. She watched centuries of decay and growth in the forest, the slow dance of rot and renewal. She learned the language of the shadows as they lengthened and shrank across the floors. She was the guardian of a perfect, self-contained silence. One evening, a great storm rolled in from the lake. It was a furious, violent thing, the kind that tore trees from the earth. The wind screamed like a thing in pain, and the rain lashed the old windows. Christie stood in the library, watching the chaos. For the first time in decades, she felt a stir of something akin to emotion. Not fear, but a sharp, protective clarity. The storm was an affront. It was noise. It was change. She placed her palms flat against the cold glass. She did not speak, for she had no need of words. She simply willed. She drew upon the deep, stored quiet of the house, the centuries of absorbed stillness, and pushed it outward. Around Blackwater House, the wind died. The rain slowed, not ceasing, but falling straight down in a gentle, silent curtain. The screaming in the pines became a sigh, then a hush. The storm raged and boiled just beyond the property line, a wall of fury and sound. But within the grounds, a perfect calm held, a bubble of eternal evening, of breathless peace. When the storm passed at dawn, the sun broke through the clouds. Steam rose from the drenched earth everywhere, except the land belonging to Blackwater. There, the grass glistened, cool and untouched. A deer, its flanks heaving, stepped out of the battered woods and onto the driveway. It did not startle or run. It lowered its head and grazed, its breath a soft, visible plume in the chill, quiet air. Christie watched from the window, a faint smile on her lips. She had not just preserved the quiet. She had defended it. She had shaped it. She was no longer just the mistress of the house. She was its will. And the quiet was not a blanket smothering the land, but a sovereign, gentle kingdom. And she would reign over it forever, listening to the beautiful, soundless song. I'm now in Story 6. The hallway was wrong. It was the same hallway, of course, the one in the old craftsman house on Sycamore Street he had walked down 10,000 times. The same honey-colored oak floorboards, their varnish worn to a soft patina by generations of socks and bare feet. The same faded runner, a Persian ghost of burgundy and navy. The same 5 doors, bathroom, linen closet, his childhood room, his parents' room, the attic door at the end. The morning light fell through the window on the landing in the same dusty, slanted column, illuminating the same motes of dust performing their silent, endless ballet. Yet it was all as subtly, profoundly incorrect as a reflection in a funhouse mirror. The perspective felt elongated, as if the far wall had retreated an inch during the night. The shadows under the doors were too deep, pools of crude oil rather than absence of light. The air, usually smelling of lemon polish and coffee, carried a faint metallic chill, like the breath of an empty church in winter. Connor stood at the mouth of this familiar, unfamiliar place, his bare feet cold on the wood, and felt the first true, undiluted terror since the funeral. It was the terror of the domestic gone feral, the known world quietly slipping its gears. He had gone to sleep a man hollowed out by grief. Autumn was 3 weeks in the ground. The official story was a hit and run on a rainy evening, a shadow fleeing into the slick black streets, never found. Connor had absorbed the tragedy like a sponge absorbs poison, swelling with a sorrow so dense it felt like a second skeleton. He woke with a headache, a dull, deep throb centered at his temples, as if he had slept with his skull in a vise. He raised a hand to rub his forehead, and his fingers met not skin, but something cool, something ridged and unyielding. He traced the curve, the smooth taper, the sharp, wicked point. His heart stopped. Then it began to hammer against his ribs like a frantic bird in a jar. He stumbled to the bathroom, avoiding the mirror above the sink for a long minute, staring instead at the familiar crack in the porcelain, the rust stain under the faucet. When he finally looked, he did not scream. The sound that came out was a low animal whimper, trapped in his throat. From just above his temples, curving up and back like the horns of a young ram, were two spirals of bone-dark, polished keratin. They were seamless, as if they had grown from within, pushing out through his skin without wound or blood. They felt ancient. They felt like his. His mother, when she came to call him for breakfast, did scream. A short, sharp sound she cut off with her hand, pressed to her mouth. Her eyes, the same hazel as his, widened, not with horror at first, but with a profound, spiritual confusion. "Connor," she whispered, as if testing the name of a stranger. His father, a pragmatic man who fixed lawnmowers for a living, stood behind her, his face draining of all color until it was the gray of old newspaper. "What in God's name?" he breathed, but did not finish. The horns did not invite completion. They were a full stop in the middle of a life sentence. He retreated to his room, to the bed that still sometimes smelled of autumn shampoo. The world outside his window was the same. Mrs. Henderson was walking her pug. Mr. Claypool was fetching his newspaper. But the hallway had been wrong, and now he was wrong, and he understood that the world had simply decided to reveal its true, crooked face to him. The power came the next day, when he ventured out for food. Mrs. Henderson, with her pug, waved with her usual brittle cheer. "Morning, Connor. Terrible about autumn, just terrible." As she spoke, looking at his forehead but politely, desperately pretending not to, a voice slithered into his mind. It was her voice, but stripped of its sweetness, raw and rancid. "I saw her that night, arguing with that Ivan fellow by the old mill. Looked heated. Didn't want to get involved. Never do. Dog needs his thyroid pill." Connor stared, stunned. Her smile remained, a perfect, painted-on thing, while her secret, petty truth hung in the air between them, a stench only he could smell. It was not mind-reading. It was truth-compelling. The horns, it seemed, were a tuning fork for the soul's darkest frequency. They vibrated with the hidden, the shameful, the rotten, and people, when they looked at him, could not help but resonate in turn. At the grocery store, the pious checkout girl, offering condolences, thought loudly, probably better off. She was always too wild for him anyway. The thought arrived wrapped in a smug religious certainty that made Connor's stomach turn. The teenage bag boy, avoiding his gaze, mentally replayed stealing a bottle of vodka from his father's cabinet last night. The truths were not always monumental, but they were always true, and their cumulative effect was a deafening cacophony of human frailty. He sought out Ivan. Ivan, his oldest friend, who had held him up at the funeral, whose eyes had been red raw. Ivan, who owned the auto shop and had dated Autumn briefly years ago before Connor. A friendship that had weathered that minor storm. Connor found him under the hood of a Chevy, hands black with grease. "Connor," Ivan said, straightening up. His eyes went to the horns, widened, then flicked away. A complex dance of shock, fear, and something else. Pity? Guilt? Jesus, man. What happened? "I don't know," Connor said, his voice rough from disuse. "But I need to know what happened to Autumn." Ivan wiped his hands on a rag, a slow, deliberate motion. "Hit and run. You know that." And then it came, not as a clear sentence, but as a violent, sensory burst. The smell of rain on hot asphalt, the swish of a windshield wiper, the tight grip of hands on a steering wheel, a flash of blonde hair and headlights, a thump that was not loud, but felt in the bones, and the overwhelming, nauseating wave of relief. The relief was the worst part. It was cold and clean and absolute. Connor took a step back, hitting a tool cart. The wrenches rattled like bones. "You were there." Avon's face went still. "What?" "You were there." The words were flat. The horns hummed, a low, subaudible vibration. "You saw it. You felt relief." The practiced mask of concern on Ivan's face cracked. Something feral and frightened peered out. The confidential, intimate truth pressed against Connor's mind, not from Ivan's deliberate thought, but drawn out by the cursed antlers on his head. "She was going to tell you. She found the invoices, the odometer rollbacks. She said she'd tell the state, tell everyone. It would have ruined me, ruined my dad's shop. It was an accident. She ran out. I didn't mean, but when it was done, God, Connor, I was so glad. There was no shouted confession, just the silent, screaming transmission of truth from one ruined soul to another." Ivan's eyes filled with a terrible understanding. He knew Connor knew. The grease-stained rag fell from his limp hand. Connor did not attack him. He turned and walked out of the garage into the blinding afternoon sun. The world had not changed, yet everything had. The town around him was no longer a collection of houses and streets, but a fragile shell over a writhing nest of secrets. Every smiling face was a lid on a box of snakes. His grief for Autumn curdled, mixing with the viscous poison of betrayal, transforming into something new, something as hard and dark, and pointed as the horns on his head. He became a ghost, walking through the town, a truth detector in a world of lies. He walked past the mayor, who thought of the embezzled park funds, past the librarian who fantasized about burning down the house of the neighbor whose dog barked all night, past his own aunt, who, while handing him a casserole, vividly remembered the thrill of an affair 20 years prior. The horns drew it all out, this miasma of hidden sin. He was a walking confessional, and everyone was a penitent whispering their darkest deeds, whether they wished to or not. His family fractured under the strain. His mother's love became a frantic, trembling thing, constantly battling her revulsion. Her thoughts, when she looked at him, were a chaotic swirl of baby pictures and nightmares of demonic possession. His father retreated into a cold, practical silence, his mind a fortress of mundane details, carburetor specs, grocery lists, to wall out the incomprehensible thing his son had become. The house on Sycamore Street was no longer a home, but a museum of a life that had ended. The walls seemed to absorb the misery, the floral wallpaper pulsing faintly with it. The floorboards creaked with a new, complaining tone. At night, the wind through the old eaves didn't whistle. It muttered. He went to the old mill, the place of the argument Mrs. Henderson had secretly witnessed. It was a decaying cathedral of brick and rust, smelling of damp river clay and pigeon droppings. He stood where Autumn must have stood, facing the ghost of Avon. He could almost hear her voice, not the gentle one she used with him, but the fierce, righteous one she saved for injustice. "You're cheating people, Ivan. People who trust you. I won't let you." He saw it all, not as a vision, but as a truth etched into the very atoms of the place, now audible to his new senses. The rain, the shouted words, the shove that wasn't meant to be a shove, the stumble into the road, the approaching lights of another car, not Ivan's. A stranger panicking, fleeing. Ivan's crime was not murder, but manslaughter born of anger and fear. His sin was the relief that followed. Confrontation was inevitable. It happened in Ivan's apartment over the shop, a place that smelled of motor oil and stale beer. Ivan was drunk, his defenses drowned. He didn't deny it. The horns saw to that. They pulled the whole story out of him, a ragged, sobbing confession that filled the room like a toxic gas. I loved her too once, Ivan slurred, tears cutting through the grime on his cheeks. And I liked you. I still like you. But you have those things. You see it all, don't you? The rotten core. There's nothing but rot. Connor looked at his friend, the boy he'd built tree forts with, the man who had killed his love through pride and cowardice. The horns ached, a deep, sympathetic ache. He realized they did not judge. They only revealed. And in revealing, they transformed the revealer as much as the audience. He was no longer just Connor, the grieving boyfriend. He was the truth-bearer, the unwelcome mirror. The anger left him then, not in a cathartic wave, but in a slow, chilling leak. What was left was a vast, empty desolation, as cold and infinite as space. He left Ivan weeping on the floor. He walked back through the town, but he did not go home. The house on Sycamore Street, with its wrong hallway and its shattered family, held nothing for him. He walked past the limits into the pine woods that bordered the town. The trees closed around him, their silence a balm after the psychic noise. The needle-strewn earth was soft. The only truths here were ancient and simple. Decay, growth, predation, silence. He found a clearing where a lightning-struck oak lay like a fallen giant. He sat against its mossy trunk, the horns fitting into a hollow in the wood as if it were a cradle. He was so tired. The weight of the town's hidden self was a mantle of lead on his shoulders. He thought of Autumn, not of her death, but of her laugh. The way she squinted in the sun, the precise weight of her head on his shoulder. A pure memory, untainted by anyone else's secret thoughts. He held onto it as the sun dipped below the pines and the stars, cold and indifferent, pricked through the velvet dark. He slept, and as he slept, he dreamed not of horns, or truths, or betrayal. He dreamed a dream of the tree. He felt his consciousness seep down, through the horns into the wood, into the vast, slow network of roots and mycelium, into the deep, dark patience of the earth. He was not a man anymore, but a node in a silent, truthful system. The town's secrets were just fleeting sparks above, insignificant to the long, slow truth of stone and sap and time. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, a hiker found the clearing. She saw the magnificent, dead oak. She saw the carpet of moss and ferns. She saw a peculiar, smooth indentation in the wood of the fallen trunk. And beside it, lying in a bed of soft green, two strange, beautiful objects. They were dark, spiraled, and polished by the elements, like artifacts from a lost civilization. They looked almost like horns. She picked one up. It was cool and lighter than it looked. For a fleeting second, holding it, she had a crystal-clear, unbidden memory of a cruel lie she told her sister when they were children. A lie she had forgotten for decades. A pang of sharp, unexpected shame hit her. She dropped the horn as if it were hot. She looked around the empty, sun-dappled clearing. There was no sign of anyone. Just the quiet woods, the fallen tree, and the two curious relics. She decided not to touch them again. Some things, she felt with a primitive certainty, were better left where they lay. She continued her hike, and the memory of the shame and the strange objects began to blur at the edges almost immediately, softening into the vague, half-remembered quality of a dream upon waking. The woods held their breath. The hollow in the oak waited, empty and patient, for the next truth to grow. The walk back to town was a journey through a world stripped bare. Every face Connor saw now was a mask, and he knew the precise shape of the face beneath. The horns were gone, shed like a skin he had outgrown, but their function remained. The truth sense was not an external tool anymore. It was internal, woven into the fabric of his perception. He didn't need the physical protrusions to tune the frequency. He was the frequency. He went to the police station first. He didn't report a crime. He simply asked to speak to Detective Miller, the weary man who had handled Autumn's case. Connor sat in the cold, plastic chair and told him everything, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. He described the invoices, the odometer rollbacks, the argument, the shove, the relief. He spoke with a flat, unshakable certainty that made the detective's pen slow, then stop. Connor's eyes held no hysteria, only the calm, deep knowledge of a stone at the bottom of a well. "I can't act on this," Miller said finally, rubbing his temple. "It's hearsay. It's a story from a grieving boyfriend who..." He trailed off, his professional skepticism warring with something else. A truth, leaking from him, brushed Connor's mind. The forensics were inconclusive. The paint chips didn't match any local vehicles. It never sat right. "You have a reason to look again," Connor said softly. "At his shop records, at his phone GPS for that night. You'll find the truth. It wants to be found." He left the station before the detective could form another objection. His next stop was his parents' house. He stood on the porch, looking at the familiar door. The wrongness of the hallway was gone. Now, he understood it had been a warning, a spatial representation of the distortion his new nature caused in the world. He was the wrongness. He had simply come home to it. His mother opened the door. Her eyes flew to his forehead, to the smooth, unmarked skin where the horns had been. A dizzying cocktail of emotions erupted from her. Overwhelming relief, a spike of fear that he had cut them off, a deeper, shameful hope that it had all been a terrible dream. "They're gone," he said, answering the unspoken question. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, reaching for him. But her hands stopped halfway. The truth of him, the essential change, radiated from his stillness. He was not her healed son returned. He was something else. "I know about Ivan," Connor said, looking past her to where his father stood in the hallway. The real hallway, its proportions restored but its meaning forever altered. "It's being handled, but I can't stay here." His father's mind was a storm of practical worries. What will people say? What will he do for work? Where will he live? All of it a dam holding back a flood of grief for the son he had already lost. "Where will you go?" his mother asked, her voice small. "Where I need to be," he replied. It was the only answer he had. He packed a single bag, ignoring the ghost of Autumn's scent on his pillow. He took only plain clothes, a little money, and the two small, smooth stones he pocketed from the clearing. Their weight, a reminder of the tree's silence. At the door, he turned back. He saw not just his parents, but the truth of their love for him. A fierce, tangled human thing, frayed by fear, but unbroken. He accepted it, as he was learning to accept all truths, without judgment. "Goodbye," he said, and it was a farewell to more than them. He walked out of town, not into the woods this time, but toward the highway. He hitched a ride with a long-haul trucker, a burly man with a kind face who thought loudly about his daughter's college tuition and his own failing marriage. Connor listened, not intruding, but receiving. The man, after an hour of silence, suddenly began to talk, pouring out his worries about his daughter, his regrets about his wife. "Don't know why I'm telling you this, kid," he muttered, embarrassed. "It's okay," Connor said, and it was. Weeks later, in a city 200 miles away, Connor sat on a bench in a crowded park. The psychic noise was a roar here, a tidal wave of secret desires, hidden angers, quiet joys, and crushing despairs. He had learned to let it wash over him, to not grasp at individual threads, lest he drown. He was not a confessor anymore. He was a witness. A young woman sat down on the other end of the bench, crying softly into her hands. The truth of her situation emanated from her in sharp, painful jabs. A positive test, a partner who left, no money, no family. Despair so thick it was a taste in the air. Connor didn't look at her. He simply reached into his pocket and placed one of the smooth stones from the clearing on the bench between them. He got up and walked away. After a few minutes, the woman's crying subsided. She noticed the stone, ordinary yet strangely placid. She picked it up, her fingers closing around its cool surface. For a moment, a screaming panic in her mind stilled. A single clear thought arose, not her own, yet felt in her bones. You have survived every hard day until now. It was not a solution. It was a truth. And for the first time in weeks, it felt like enough. She clutched the stone, took a deep, shuddering breath, and stood up. Connor watched from across the park, a silhouette against the setting sun. He felt the shift in her, the tiny, crucial realignment. He touched his own forehead, smooth and unmarked. The horns were gone, but the purpose remained. He was not a curse. He was a corrective, a silent, wandering pressure applied to the world's hidden fractures. He turned and walked into the neon-drenched evening, a conduit for the difficult, necessary truth, leaving small, quiet changes in his wake, like stones dropped into a dark, still pond. Thank you for making it all the way to the end, and for joining me on another journey through our nighttime scary stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tales, and to help our channel grow. Wishing you a calm, peaceful good night, and I'll see you tomorrow with a brand new story.